Hey everyone, we're going to be talking about depression today. I want to get right into it, so I'll share my screen here shortly, but I just wanted to start off by saying that depression is relatively common, especially in terms of the different types of disorders that we see, and I'm hoping the things we talk about here can be helpful to some of you out there. Depression is as common as 8.3% of the population. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. And that's across any given one period of time. Across the lifespan, it's actually pretty common for people to experience depressive episodes. So let me get into the criteria here. I'm going to switch screens and then we'll talk about it. And as always, feel free to ask any questions. I'm happy to answer anything. All right, let's see how that looks. That looks really good. So let me switch over here. Area from the DSM-5 TR. And for those of you who do not know what this is, that is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, 5th edition, text revision. It's basically our magic book of mental illnesses, and this is the diagnostic criteria that we follow, especially in America. Other countries might use the ICD-10 or 11, but here we often use the DSM-5. So let's get right into the criteria here. I don't want to go through too much, neurobiology, circuits, complex mechanisms. Typically, when people feel depressed, they know it. It's not always the case, but oftentimes they know it because it's such a crushing and hollow feeling to be depressed. So I want to spend most of the time on behavioral activation. That's the technique we're going to focus on for this live stream. I found it to be very helpful in therapy in terms of what I give to patients. I've gotten good feedback, and I want to give that to people here as well. Hopefully, this is something that you all can integrate on your own. But of course, if you need help, you're always welcome to try out therapy or something else for yourself. So, criteria for major depressive disorder. 5 or more of the following symptoms that have been present for the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. I'm going to pull out the pen here so I can show things a little bit better. It's very important stuff. So, first criteria here, right? We need 5 or more, and we need to see a change in functioning. So, if this is more of your baseline in terms of how you feel, that's something to note as well, right? Is this a significant change or is this more of your baseline? And then at least one of the two, depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure, something we call anhedonia. These are the two most common types of symptoms we see for depression. Someone feels depressed or they can't enjoy things that they would normally experience in life. What does that actually feel like beyond just a basic description? Well, it's hard to put that into words, but the feelings you get, those can come through thoughts, the inability to do things that are meaningful for you because they don't feel pleasurable, or it can even be felt physically. Like I've said before, a hollow feeling, kind of a negative feeling. You can feel physical weakness in your body as well. Depression is very well linked to a number of biological bases, all the way down to neurotransmitters. This isn't something that people are just making up. It's very, very real, and it's a difficult disorder to deal with. So, there's also a difference between feeling sad and feeling depressed. We'll talk about that in just a little bit here. It comes down to clinically significant distress. I will explain what that means in just a second. Okay, so as we just mentioned already, depressed mood for most of the day, nearly every day, is indicated by subjective report or some other type of measurement. Anhedonia is the second one, so we need one of these first two. Anhedonia means, let's say I normally enjoy going out for runs and something happened in my life, or I just start to feel depressed. And now I don't really go on runs anymore because I don't enjoy them. There's kind of a numbness that you feel, a sense of detachment, a sense of numbness, a sense of hollowness. It's kind of difficult to put into words, but if you felt it before, it's very visceral in that sense. Significant weight loss or weight gain, just fluctuations in weight, that's another criterion we look at. And you could imagine why, right? If you feel numb, if you feel unhappy, if you don't enjoy things, eating is probably not on the top of your list. Although it could be for some people, they might engage in eating certain types of foods as a way to cope with these negative feelings that they have. Again, depression has a very strong neurochemical basis. And what are you doing when you eat foods and digest them? That's going to change neurochemical bases that you have, right? Even if it's temporary, that's going to cause changes there. All right. Insomnia or hypersomnia, again, changes in sleep. People often engage in avoidance behaviors when they feel depressed. And when you feel depressed, you might sleep more. Oftentimes, we might see that patients sleep 12 to 14 hours a day. Unfortunately, people just feel that being asleep is more, it's less suffering than being awake or being depressed during the day. So they might engage in sleep, excess amounts of sleep. Or they can't sleep at all because of how negative they feel. It really goes either way. Psychomotor agitation or retardation. So, this is just referring to what I was talking about earlier as well, in terms of what you feel physically. Some people with depression, they seem to move really slow, just that connection between what you want to do psychologically and what you physically do, that can alter as well. Fatigue or loss nearly every day. I don't need to explain all of these. I think some of them are relatively self explanatory. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt. So that's something as well. Diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness. When you feel depressed, there's something we call a negative bias, right? If we show a neutral face to someone who's depressed is more likely to say that the neutral face looks unhappy or there's unhappy components to it. I wouldn't necessarily call it a delusion, but it's more of a bias in terms of how information is viewed. So when you have this negative sort of bias, everything you do is shaped kind of like having a grayscale perspective on any type of image. That is something that is hard to see past because it shapes the very perception from the beginning of your experience. Recurrent thoughts of death, suicidal ideations, suicidal behaviors, these come up as well. And one of the reasons they come up is because your mind is trying to problem solve this depression. It's trying to figure out ways to navigate. And as twisted as it sounds, having having thoughts about killing yourself, that is a solution that your mind conjures in these types of situations. You will hear this often from depressed patients. They're very hesitant to say it at first because they know it's mental health. They don't want to be sent to a psychiatric facility against their will. But it's actually relatively normal for people with certain levels of depression to have those types of thoughts because their mind is trying to figure out what to do. It's like, okay, well, yeah, technically, if you were dead, you supposedly wouldn't feel depressed, right? Not justifying it by any means. I'm just trying to give some context there. Okay, now B here, symptoms cause clinically significant distress. Again, this is pretty important because if you don't have this piece, you can't really diagnose the disorder. If you're sad, but you can handle things, you can get by, and it's not too bad, especially if it's more transitory, right? We're talking about 2 weeks here as opposed to something that might be a few hours. That's where you differentiate a disorder versus not a disorder. Then there's other criteria here. I don't really want to go into that. So that's the basics of major depressive disorder. Again, when you're talking to someone, if they feel depressed, they can tell you, right? They know when they feel depressed. So let's go into behavioral activation. This is where I want to spend all of the time today. It's a very important technique. And on top of that, it relates to the psychology of awakening pretty well here. Let me see if I can switch. Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect. That looks good. So, behavioral activation, before I even talk about this basic model right here, I'm going to start with drawing a couple things. So, when we talk about behavioral activation, which I'll just put as BA here, we're talking about two types of cycles. So, I'm going to draw a couple arrows here. And this is probably the easiest way to understand what we're trying to do when we discuss behavioral activation. For people who are depressed, we very commonly see this pattern. We see that on one level, there are behaviors of avoidance. And on the other side, oh, I spelled avoidance wrong. Let me fix that. And on the other side, you see worsening depression. So I'll just put an arrow up to indicate worsening and then depression. Pretty self explanatory, right? Maybe I should type the rest of these out. This is the basic idea with behavioral activation, right? Whenever you are experiencing depression, you are more likely to avoid doing things that are meaningful for you in life because it's harder to do them, right? Whenever we do an activity, we might feel something reinforcing about what's going on. If you're doing an activity and you feel good, your chances of doing that activity go up again, right? If something feels good, you typically want that outcome again. Now, if you engage in avoidance behaviors, which is something that we see commonly with depression, then you are going to miss out on something that's important in your life because you have basically convinced yourself or told yourself that if I don't do something, if I just stay in bed, that is easier than getting up and doing the activity, right? That motivation piece, the fatigue piece, the energy, all those things come into play. And if you are avoiding behaviors, then you are going to feel more depressed because you're not doing something that's meaningful for yourself. People are not going to say that staying in bed as opposed to living their life is meaningful, right? This is an ineffective way to deal with psychological suffering, this notion of avoidance. So when you have avoidance, it's going to spiral into depression. Depression is going to spiral into avoidance, and you're going to get stuck very fast. So, what do we do about this? Well, we do the opposite, right? It's pretty basic in this sense. I'm not going to draw this all out again because it's going to take forever. So, I'll just scroll down here. What we're going to do is we're going to improve the depressed mood by engaging in more pleasurable activities. It sounds so basic, right? This is what we see often with psychological methods, at least in my experience. It's that these methods are pretty straightforward, pretty easy to intellectually understand, but to actually do them, that's where the skill comes into play. If you just tell someone who's depressed, well, go outside, take a walk. Are they going to do it? Probably not, right? It's easier said than done in that case. I always think of Chester Bennington as a good example of someone, well, not a good example, but someone who was depressed and really struggling, right? He's making tons of good music. He was really famous. He's doing so well, but you could always see in interviews whenever he was talking how depressed he felt. You can see it in his music as well, just a very colorful depiction of the emotions and what it was he was going through. So, in that same kind of way, what someone is feeling in terms of depression, it's very difficult to see from another person's perspective because you're not inside of their skin, you're not within their perspective. So, just telling someone to do something isn't going to work easily. That's why we work up gradually with behavioral activation. So, anyone who's attempting to do this, and we're going to go over different techniques that work, specific principles, but I want you to start small. If you start big, like oftentimes in therapy, I'll see somebody and we get them all riled up and motivated. It's like, okay, we got the plan, we got behavioral activation, it's going to work, it's going to help. And then they come and say, all right, I'm going to go to the gym for 2 hours today. Even though they haven't gone to the gym in the past 6 months, they've gained 30 pounds and they feel like crap all the time. Is that going to work? I mean, yeah, maybe they might go to the gym for one day, do it for 2 hours, probably feel miserable because they're overexerting themselves, and then they're just going to give up. So if we set a smaller goal, something that is more fitting to what they can do, then we can gradually build them up. That's where we see this part of the behavioral activation model, right? Whenever we are engaging in pleasant activities, that is so important. It's not just doing activities, it's pleasant activities. Going to the gym for 2 hours, even if you train a lot, going to the gym for 2 hours can be very difficult. So we want to find things that are small, manageable, and trainable. I won't spend too much time on this model unless there's questions about it, because I think it's relatively straightforward to understand on an intellectual level. It's more so about how do you integrate this in your day to day life? How do you actually do this? That's what I want to focus on because whenever you look up videos for depression, which I surveyed a little bit beforehand, people will talk for hours and they will give you intellectualized solutions. But I want to give you something that, hey, try it out for yourself, do it for yourself, and see if it works. It will work if you do it in the ways that we talk about here. So instead of going through the theory and stuff, I just want to give you the core tools here. So again, I'll just review this for a few seconds and then we'll move on here. Depression worsens when you avoid doing things that are important in your life. Depression improves when you do things that are important in your life. Okay. Very simple here. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, just let me know. And then briefly, I want to touch on the ACT model or the psychological flexibility model. I'm going into this because it gives a much stronger foundation for what we're trying to do. I only want you to focus on this right side here. Okay. If you are feeling depressed, and let me clarify this as well, this is the inflexibility side. When we scroll down, we have the flexibility side. So this is actually two sides of a coin. This is the side we want to be on, and this is the side we don't want to be on, right? This is the side that we know very well from literature and from working with patients. If you have these components, it leads to a lot of psychological suffering. If you have these components, then psychological suffering alleviates to a pretty good extent. So again, I want you to focus on the right side here. Whenever we talk about the psychological flexibility model, the four components that I did not square, those are different types of mechanisms. They're not necessarily behavioral, though. The behavioral parts are the ones that I circled or squared here. Behavioral activation, right? That's what we're doing. So I want you to focus on the behavioral parts. And we're going to go over this with the different principles as well. But I'm bringing this up because values, this is what we need to make behavioral activation work. I'm not so sure it's obvious what values mean whenever you hear it. People kind of have a general expectation of what it means. Whenever I talk to patients and I ask them what values are, they'll give me a basic answer, but they don't give me an answer that I want them to have in terms of what works for behavioral activation. So when we talk about values, we're talking about meaningful life directions. And these are meaningful life directions that are stable across the lifespan because they are so closely correlated to personality factors and what it is that brings us joy when we behaviorally do things. So, as you could imagine, it's not complicated to see how understanding your values allows you to understand what works for you in terms of behavioral strategies. So, we'll go over values in a second. I will get to that with the principles part. And then the last piece, right? This is the most important part of any type of therapy. And when we relate this to the psychology of awakening later on, all of this is behavioral, right? Wherever you look, you see that the approaches that work for mental health, they are behavioral. It comes down to what you do. What you do shapes who you are, how you think, how you feel, how you become, what you become, and all those different categories, right? It's a bit of a side here, but if you're familiar with Buddhist teachings at all, they talk about the 12 links of dependent origination. You can see that that is a very behavioral path as well. We have it here on the science side. If you look at other types of spiritual teachings, you will see that as well. So what we do comes down to the specific goals that we attain towards our, oh, that's written really poorly, specific goals that we have attained towards our values. Okay. So when we come down here, see values, we define as knowing what matters. I think it's better defined as meaningful life directions in pursuit of what's important to you in life and what you're willing to endure or work through in terms of psychological distress to attain those values for yourself. And then effective action or committed action, doing what it takes. right? This is the most important part, in my opinion, of the entire psychological flexibility model and what it is that works for behavioral activation as a whole. It comes down to what you actually do. See, one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that engaging in avoidance behaviors, that is what you are doing. That is still doing something. They always tell me, not always, but oftentimes I hear from patients, well, I stayed in bed. I didn't do anything. It's like, yes, you did. You stayed in bed. That is doing something. And when they make that click, they realize, oh, I am spending my psychological resources. I am spending a lot of these different ways in terms of what I could be doing in my day to day life. I'm spending that time doing things that are not important for me. Whenever they make that realization, they see that there's a choice here, right? What you do or what you don't do, it can either be determined by your values or it can be determined by inflexibility or things that are not important to you in life. Are you going to do things based on what's important to you in life, or are you going to do things towards the goal of avoiding suffering? Very different things. Unfortunately, a lot of people will pick, they wish for the former, but they will pick the latter. They wish to do things that are important in their life, but they often find that it's too difficult. So they're more so focused on just avoiding things that are too distressful. That is a short-term solution, and again, that keeps you spiraling within that piece of depression. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. I have different videos on the other components of the psychological flexibility model. They're all related as well, but I want to focus on the behavioral piece. Okay, so let's get right into the principles here. So whenever, and let me see if I can find, yeah, there we go, perfect. I can type now. So, for someone who is trying to do something about their depression, that's what I want to spend the time on here. And obviously, I'm going to put chapter markers so that someone can just skip right to this point. This is what I want you to do. I'm going to pretend like I'm talking to someone and working with someone who has depression and is trying to navigate through it here. Okay, so we've discussed depression, we've discussed what it is, and now we've discussed the behavioral activation model. So, the next thing we need to do is explain the importance of behavior. Behavior is what you do, it is the way an action, behavior is the way an action is conducted in an environment. Okay. So your environment is just your life, right? It's what's around you. What's around me right now, what's inside of my head, internal environment, external environment. Those are both environments. What is it that we're doing within our environment? This is what we want to change. This is the heart of behavioral activation. This is the heart of pretty much any therapy that works. We have to change behaviors. Okay, so how are we going to do this? We're going to start with small goals. We're going to start with very small things that people do. And if I was talking to someone here, I'd probably break this down a little bit further. I would want to discuss, what are your values, right? What are your goals? What is it that you want to do in life? What is it that we're working towards? Any good therapy approach, regardless of the modality, regardless of the therapist, any good approach is going to determine solid goals. What are we doing in therapy? What is it that you want? Most people are going to say something like, I just want to feel less depressed. Why? Why is that important to you? Why do you want to feel less depressed? If you just wanted to feel less depressed, you could just go to sleep all the time, right? Technically, you don't feel depressed when you're sleeping. So, what is it that you want? There has to be something more fundamental here. That's when we start to talk about values. Whenever we dig a little bit more, we start to see that, hey, there is something more that I want to do. Maybe I want to help the world in terms of reducing suffering that other people experience. Maybe I want to start up a really big company so that I can help advance technology in the world towards bettering humanity. Maybe it's some other type of value or goal, right? You want to work on that. Think about what it is that's important to you. What's the point of doing all of this? Because if you don't know these answers, kind of like what I spoke about last week with nihilism, you're going to get stuck in that piece, right? Especially with depression, that negative bias that you feel whenever you have that, it becomes difficult to see things from a different perspective because everything looks negative, everything looks gloomy and dreary, and everything feels like nothing matters. That is the last place you want to be in terms of doing behavioral activation. Because if you don't have that solid foundation, what you do is going to feel pointless. So, if that's something you need to work on, then I would recommend starting there. Once you have figured that out, I don't want to spend too much time on that here because we're focused on the behavioral activation piece. And oftentimes, people know what it is they want to do, they just don't know how to do it. So, I want to spend more time on the behavioral activation piece here. Once you know what your values are and what your goals are, we want to think of things you can do, behaviors you can complete towards those values. I'm going to pull from a patient I saw a while back and use that as an example. So, this individual was in the military and he was enlisted and he was in one of the specialties within the Air Force where you really get to see some action, right? Boots on the ground, so to speak, really engaging in things, kind of being out there, being in the field, and got a really bad knee injury. He got this knee injury, and once he recovered physically, they did surgery, did what they needed to do. He continued to feel excruciating pain in his knee. And this was causing so many issues that he couldn't pass his PT test or his physical training test. And when this happened, they're starting to wonder if this guy can do his duties in the military, right? So they send him over for therapy. What's going on with this guy? Physically, everything looks good, but he's still complaining about this pain. And this is someone who really wants to be in the military, right? He loves what he's doing. He wants to get back to it, but the pain is just so much that he is defaulting to avoiding things in life as opposed to doing what's important to him because the pain is that bad. So in this case, we could talk about values and goals and understand pretty well what this guy wants to do, right? So we started pretty small with him. And yeah, we'll get to that part in a little bit here. I'm probably going to overlap with some of the other principles later on. That's totally fine. We'll just go through it as we do. So what we did for him was we started really small, right? He's coming in and military people, a lot of them, they're just ready to go. They want to get into it. They're really hardworking people. And I said, we need to slow down. Okay. Because at this point, you're just staying at home, you're on medical leave, and you're not really doing anything important, right? That's what you're telling me. You're telling me that staying home is not important to you. So we need to start building you up again, right? Dealing with chronic pain, once you transition from that acute pain, which is pretty well based in a physiological cause, and then you switch to chronic pain, which doesn't really have a physiological cause. In other words, they can't find it with medical evidence. Once you get to that point, we have to start working on that chronic pain piece. So what we did was for the behavioral activation part, this guy loves being outside, this guy loves doing things. We just started with a really small goal. So when was the last time you walked outside? That's it. When was the last time you walked outside? He said something like it's been weeks or months since I did that. I don't even walk anymore unless I just have to go to the bathroom or the kitchen and back. So I said, "Okay, let's start with just walking down the block and walking back." And he said, "Okay, I can do that. I'll do it every day of the week." And I said, "Are you sure? Because that's a lot. It's harder than it sounds given the pain that you're in." He said, "Sure, I'll do it." Comes back the next week. He only walks up and down the block twice that week. That's it. He said he's going to do it 7 times. He only did it 2 times. That goal was too big as well. Start with a really, really, let me put another really there, really, really small goal. Okay. And the reason for this is because when you feel depressed, you feel unmotivated. You feel Oftentimes you feel like a loser, you feel like a failure, you feel like you can't do anything meaningful in your life, so you just avoid. If we start with a really, really small goal and we work our way up, then you start to that reteach yourself that you can attain goals you set for yourself, right? If you are in pain, like that patient, for example, and he wants to walk more, and we say, "Hey, I want you to go on the treadmill for 15 seconds, just 15 seconds. That's it. Just get on the treadmill and walk for 15 seconds. And I want you to do that just twice in a week. That's it, 2 times in a week." He's going to say, "That's ridiculous. That sounds so easy." I said, "Okay, if it's so easy, do it. Come back, prove it to me next week." And then he does. He's like, "Okay, I did 15 seconds. That was so easy. I actually stayed on the treadmill for 2 minutes both times. So I did 4 minutes total." It's like, "Oh, here we go." Right now we're getting somewhere. We're not just talking about, "Hey, my pain is so bad. I have to avoid doing everything." Now this is, "Oh, hey, I can actually do things even more than I thought I could initially." Right? Or I could do things more than this guy thinks I can do. Instead of 15 seconds, now we're looking at 2 minutes. It's like, okay, now we can start to amp up, right? That motivation is there, that understanding that you can do things, that is there. So that's great. That's an example there of something you can do in terms of a really small goal. So think about that for yourself. What is it that you can set for yourself? Even if it's really small, start from there, build consistency. Once you build consistency, it becomes easier to do things again. Because when that reinforcing value comes and you start to feel good from what it is you're doing, then you can start to make more progress in terms of what the outcome is. So let's move on here to principle 2. Changes in life are associated with depression, and short term coping strategies may inadvertently maintain depression over time. So, yeah, this is something I talked about a little bit earlier, right? The avoidance piece. What is contributing to your avoidance? Because if you're feeling depressed, then you must be avoiding doing something, right? If you feel down and maybe you enjoy doing certain exercises in the morning and you don't do them because you feel down and you're dreading work, that's something we want to look at, right? Can we get you back into doing that? So, what are the coping strategies that you are engaging in? You may think that they're helpful, but they really aren't. I'm not going to do an exercise video because it's more of an exertion for me. Well, then you feel like crap later, right? And then you don't do it again and it gets worse and worse. Okay. Clues to figuring out what will be antidepressant for a particular client lie in the ABC. So this is some therapist jargon here: antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. Antecedents, behaviors, consequences. So these are your ABCs. Okay. Antecedents: what happened before. Behaviors: what was the actual behavior. Consequences: what was the consequence. You wanted to do an exercise video, you felt too depressed, you didn't do it. Okay. I'm not working with anyone specifically here, so I can't give more specific examples, but if anybody wants to share some, I can use them. I'll just give some generic ones here. What was the behavior? You didn't do it. What was the antecedent? You didn't do it because you felt crappy. What was the consequence? You felt even more crappy because you didn't do something you initially wanted to do, right? So again, you see where that spiral comes in. So once you have that understanding, now instead of just saying, "I'm going to do a behavior versus not do it," now we're looking at, "Hey, before I even do this behavior, I'm already feeling like crap." Recognizing that is awesome because now you're picking up on not just the behavior, you're picking up on what's leading up to the behavior. And then you're also picking up on what the potential consequence could be. You're getting more context into what is going on here. That's wonderful. If you can do that, then you can see the before, after, and the behavior itself. That'll help you understand how to plan things out. So that's principle 3 there. Okay. And let's see, principle 4: structure and schedule activities that follow a plan, not a mood. This is so important because what you do shapes how you feel. Now, you could argue this bidirectionally. So, what you do shapes how you feel. And we could probably draw something like this. So, do in terms of activity shapes how you feel. And then other people might argue that what you feel shapes what you do. So which one's correct? Well, I'm going to argue that it doesn't really matter which one's correct. The point is that there's a relationship here, and we know that what you do will shape how you feel. Now, could you do this the other way and change how you feel to lead to what you do? I mean, technically, yes, you could, but it's more difficult. It's more difficult because once you start talking about feelings, cognitions, that means thoughts, mental phenomena, basically, mental activity. Let me make that so that's easier. Once you start to talk about feelings, thoughts, and mental activity, now you're having to deal with an area that's not directly tangible. Okay. What do I mean by tangible? Tangible means that you can't directly grasp what it is that's going on. But what you do in terms of an activity, so activities, behaviors, actions, these are directly tangible, right? You can physically do those things. If you tell a depressed person or someone who has depression to stop feeling depressed, they're going to look at you like you're a moron, right? Because easier said than done, right? What's the first thing that happens when you tell yourself to stop thinking things? You think about it, right? Even if you're trying to not think about it, you're still within the frame of thinking about what it is. So that mental activity is much more difficult to manage. And if we wanted to break this down to theoretical foundations, we could talk about relational frame theory. Not going to get into it here, but essentially, your mental activity is not entirely within your conscious control. You can train the way your mental activity manifests through what you do, and that's really important in the psychology of awakening, but it's also important with just managing depression in a general sense here. So, long story short here, instead of focusing on what we feel, yes, you can argue a bidirectional relationship. We're going to focus on what we do because, oh, that's a terrible circle. Hold on. Because it's easier. Okay. It's easier to change what we do rather than what we feel. And what we do is easier to not only change in terms of behavior, but it also changes what we feel. Yes, in terms of what you feel, that can change what you do. But again, it's more difficult to do that. So why make this any harder than it has to be? Again, even if you're not depressed, just try controlling or shutting down a thought for 30 seconds to a minute. It's very difficult unless you've had advanced training. Your mind is going to run in its own capacity. It does what it wants unless it's very well trained. That's a little bit deeper than behavioral activation. So at this level, just understand that what we do is easier to engage with. It's directly tangible in that sense. So we're focusing on behaviors. Okay, this one I've already covered. Change will be easier when starting small. I'll skip over this since we already went into it. Just don't think you can wake up one day, feel motivated, and then go to the gym for 2 hours or run a marathon. You need to work your way up. The same way that when you feel good and you work your way down to feeling depressed, it's a gradual process, right? Nobody wakes up one day and then just feels good and then the next day feels totally depressed. If you do have that pattern, which is possible, by the way, you're probably looking at something more of a bipolar depression. So, unipolar is just major depression, like what we're talking about here. Bipolar depression, that's when we're talking about like bipolar disorders. Your mood switches and it seems to be related to time. It's probably neurochemical, but it's a little more complicated than what we need to go into here. So let's go on to 6. Emphasize activities that are naturally reinforcing. Okay, this one again is pretty straightforward. If someone is feeling depressed, and let's say it's that military guy I was talking about, he enjoys being outdoors, and I tell him to go and code some software for a program, right? He's going to be miserable doing that. We need to pick things that are naturally reinforcing. People often have a good idea of what is naturally reinforcing for them because it's very rare to meet someone who's been completely depressed their entire life. I have met people like that who have just felt depressed their entire life, and those people are far beyond what behavioral activation alone can help with. Now, behavioral activation is still useful, but if your depression is that bad, it's going to be way too difficult to do anything. So then we need to look at medicine or other types of approaches. That's a case by case basis. So find activities that are naturally reinforcing, engage in those, and then that will help you with figuring out what it is you want to do. All right. So be a compassionate coach. This is something that is more oriented towards the therapist, but I would argue it's just as oriented towards the individual as well. Whenever we feel depressed and down, we have a lot of negative thoughts. It's not common for people to tell me that most of their mental chatter involves thoughts of wanting to kill themselves. That's all they can think of to avoid their suffering. They can't think of anything else that works. They've gone through it. It's just so difficult. They're so negative with their self. And again, how your mind operates, we've talked about this in other videos. What your mind does is reinforced by your behaviors, your action, and how you identify with your own mind. I want you to see a bit of a separation between who you are and what your mind is doing. It's very difficult to think of that if you haven't ever done it or contemplated that before. I can prove that to you when we do deeper types of practices within the psychology of awakening piece, but just take me on face value at this point. I can also prove it from relational frame theory, other types of mechanisms there. But what your mind is doing, it's not entirely who you are. It is within who you are. So when you think of it that way, maybe an easy way to understand this is your mind is kind of like a tenant inside of an apartment. Let me write that out. So let's say your apartment is your body. Your mind is just one tenant. It's just one room. Okay. There's many other things going on, right? We talked about domains of the mind, visual spatial functions, language functions, all the things that lead up to depression, negative thoughts, negative feelings, emotions. These are all different components, different tenants inside of this apartment. And if you can see that separation and maintain it, when I go back up here to the flexibility model, that is something we can categorize primarily as diffusion here, right? Watching your thinking. Just think about what that means, right? Watching your thinking. What the hell are you talking about? How do you watch your own thinking? Well, you actually can do this. And this is where a lot of those mindfulness type practices come in, a lot of meditative practices. You see a separation. See here? When we look at the inflexibility piece, we're looking at cognitive fusion. Now you are fused to your thoughts. People who are highly depressed, they describe themselves as their thoughts. Just listen to what they say whenever they talk. Or if you're feeling depressed yourself, listen to your own mental chatter. I am depressed. That is often what I hear. I am depressed. I am a failure. I'm a loser. I can't do this. You see that connection there? I am depressed. That gives you a really good understanding of how they are understanding their depression in terms of how they identify or do not identify with their relationship. So, in terms of this principle here, being, what is that, 7? Yeah. Being a compassionate coach to yourself, that involves a degree of separation. If you can understand your depression as being something within who you are, that helps you separate in the sense that this canvas, this gray, gloomy canvas that depression shapes for you kind of like pull your face back a little bit because when you're really close up on a canvas or a painting, it looks like reality to you because you can't see anything else, right? So being compassionate to yourself allows you to pull your face back a little bit and then you realize this depression is just it's just on an easel, right? It's just a canvas that's sitting there, but there's much more going on around you that you can work with instead of just that depressive perspective. So again, that's something that can really help you in terms of what you do. And going back a couple points, I won't scroll up there. When you do things based on behavior and not feeling, this is something that we can relate to here, right? Have you ever just done something even though it felt completely horrible inside of your head and then you ended up doing it anyways and you felt so good afterwards? That's exactly what we're talking about here. If you can do that even one time, you already have what it takes to defeat this depression that you are going through. Doing that for the first time is the hardest time. It really is because you're breaking a cycle that you're reinforcing for yourself. Again, we said that your mind, your behavior, yourself, everything you do, it is all shaped by what you have done over periods of time, reinforced. So breaking that reinforcement one time is all it takes. Once you see little crack in this depression, you can start to tease things apart even more. That initial buy-in that you get in therapy, whether you're talking with a therapist or just trying strategies yourself, that initial piece is usually what causes the greatest change over long periods of time, seeing that you can do it. I've had people tell me that whenever they feel so depressed, they force themselves to jump into a very cold shower. And we could talk about behavioral strategies like negative punishment or certain types of reinforcement, but even from a basic common sense, right? People people can understand that jumping into a cold shower is usually not a pleasurable thing. So, feel depressed, well, I'm going to punish that little compartment of depression by jumping in the shower, or I'm just going to jump in the shower to jumpstart myself anyways because I'm going to do things that are important to me instead of being swayed by the feelings of what's going on. If you have the gall to jump into a cold shower when you're feeling depressed, and you're able to energize yourself in that way, you're on the right track there. Not necessarily recommending you jump in a cold shower, but it could work for you. I've heard success stories from patients with that before. All right. Principle 8 here, emphasize a problem solving empirical approach and recognize that all results are useful. So, again, we're looking more at the context here. If you set a behavioral strategy for yourself, you're feeling depressed, you said, I'm going to work up to 10 minutes on the treadmill, and you're good for the first minute, the second minute, the fifth minute. But for whatever reason, at minute 8, you quit. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay. It depends on how you understand what happened. For example, let's say you were doing good. Okay. And now you've been consistent and you're working up to that 10-minute mark, and then you failed because you started to feel really queasy. You might take that and say you're a failure and then scale back to the beginning. Or you might take that and say, wow, I was able to get up to almost 8 minutes, even though I felt sick. You were still able to tolerate to a good extent, feeling not only depressed, but also feeling sick. That's pretty impressive, right? Why did you even get on the treadmill in the first place if you were feeling sick, right? Just looking at different factors there, your ability to take, again, that broader perspective and see beyond the lens of your own depression. This is something that can help you too. And I'm not going to lie, whenever you're starting this out, whether you're doing this with a therapist or by yourself, it sucks. It really sucks. It's going to actually feel a little bit worse when you initially change and do things. Why is that? Because now you are not engaging in avoidance strategies. When you avoid things, we do that because it temporarily works. Now you're fully plunging yourself into change. The fact that you feel a little bit worse is actually a good sign in the sense that you have changed something about yourself. If you're not changing and you're staying at a stagnated level, that's where I'm actually more concerned about your progress. Change that feels more positive or more negative, that's good to hear because it's still change nonetheless, and we can work with that. Okay. Principle 9. And by the way, if there's any questions, feel free to ask. No pressure at all. Principle 9, listen, understand, and remain action oriented. I'm going to cut a little bit deeper into this one here because whenever we hear things like listen and understand, everyone tells you that. Everyone just kind of understands that at face value. What we're talking about here boils down really deeply into mechanisms of attention. How is your attention applied at any given moment? Now, if you ask me to define attention as a scientist, as a psychologist, I don't know. I don't have a definition for you, but if you just want the basic understanding of attention, like when I say pay attention, you know what that is, right? Everyone kind of knows what attention is. That's a famous saying from William James. But in terms of understanding and defining it, we don't really know. So, how you apply your attention, I would say that is the most important part, if not the second most important part behind what you behaviorally do. Because attention is, people think of it as a singular cognitive construct. It is not. It is a number of different constructs at play. Maybe I'll make a different video on attention. It's too complicated for 10 minutes or even an hour. Could probably spend a few hours on that at least. But I want you to take away that your attention, it shapes everything that you do. So if you're able to apply your attention beyond depression, because whenever you feel depressed or whenever you have any type of mental disorder, by definition, that clinically significant distress piece, that means your attention has been pulled or narrowed into a way that's not helpful for you. So if you can recalibrate and collect your attention again, that relates to a number of different cognitive functions, different brain networks that allow you to see things from a broader basis. Okay. So, more than we need to get into there, but just listen, understand, remain action oriented. Whenever you feel challenges in terms of what you're doing, try to understand the challenges instead of getting stuck in the content of feeling down on yourself. Okay. Principle 10, troubleshoot possible and actual barriers to activation. This is similar to what we talked about before in terms of just getting a deeper context and understanding for what's going on. Okay, so I'm not going to belabor that point. Now, in terms of awakening, and I'm going to switch back here to the main screen. I think that did it right there. Yeah, there we go. This channel is about the psychology of awakening. And again, awakening, where we're talking about something much deeper than just behavioral activation, but they do relate here. Awakening is cutting to the core of what we are and breaking out of this misunderstanding of what we think we are. People who feel depressed, or someone who has a depressive disorder, it is a similar mechanism of action, just on a different level of specificity. So, what that means is when you have depression, everything appears a certain way because you have a certain lens in terms of how you perceive things. In the same way, when we're talking about awakening and becoming free of psychological suffering, we have to see the limitations of how our own mind and our own psychological functioning works as well. So we're essentially taking the same principles for behavioral activation, we're just applying it on a much broader basis. Instead of just dealing with depression, when we look into the psychology of awakening, we're engaging in a variety of behaviors, whether it's meditative practices or a variety of other ones, which it could involve yoga. Some people might use certain drugs. There's different ways to engage in altered states of consciousness. All of these different practices are re-exploring our psychological functioning. And we're doing that through behavioral practices. So whenever we do behavioral activation towards the psychology of awakening, we're using a variety of practices to put us into different states of perceiving reality. It's the same thing with depression, right? You are engaging in meaningful life activities, even if it's at a small level, because it gives you a different perception of what's possible, right? If you can do something small, then you start to see that, oh, I can feel good again. I can feel positive again. Whenever we apply this to awakening, we can see that very slowly we can peel back these layers of psychological functioning. These, what's a good way to put this in an analogy? It would be like taking off different glasses that you have, different shades of glasses. Maybe there's something that makes you see in red, maybe there's something that makes you see in blue. There are things that make you identify with yourself. There are things that make you believe this body, this mind, this contents of consciousness, states of consciousness. It makes you identify with those things. But really, all of those things are within what you are. Hard to explain that over words, but it's the same idea with the psychology of awakening. So, whenever we engage in behavioral practices, I bring this up because what you are training yourself to do Yeah, it might be for depression in this case, but if you can master what we're talking about here, you can apply this in a much broader context. The ability to engage in what's meaningful in your life and do behavioral activities over what your mind wants you to feel, that is such an important skill, and it translates to many different parts of our lives. It helps us to realize that functions of our mind, whether it's emotions, feelings, thoughts, behaviors, whatever it is you want to categorize them as, those are all within what we are. And you don't have to identify with them, you don't have to buy into them. You only need to use them to the extent that they're helpful for you. So, hopefully, that's helpful. I don't see any questions here, and we do still have a few minutes left. Are there any questions from anyone who's here? We'll leave that open before we close things out. We'll give it a few seconds. All right. So, bottom line here is if you were feeling depressed, I want you to start small. Pick some small things that you can change in your life that you can do, perhaps that you used to enjoy, and just start with that. No matter what you feel or how down you feel, I want you to stick to doing these things. It's going to be very difficult. Just take that, acknowledge it. It's fine. It's going to be very difficult, but I want you to build up very slowly from that in terms of using this behavioral activation strategy. Once you get progress, you can start to build things slowly from there. And hopefully, you can continually make some gains towards bettering yourself. Just realize that avoidance is a temporary strategy, and there are some other avenues that can help. So, hopefully, this was helpful for any listeners. If you have any feedback, any questions, any comments, feel free to reach out, and I will do my best to get back with you. I'll start uploading videos regularly next week. I waited on this week because I'm working some logistical things in the background. It wasn't that I forgot to upload. So that will come up starting next week. And yeah, I'll see you next Friday. Take care.